It's a blitz showdown between Ian Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces and Jacob Duda. A quiet Catalan opening will soon explode into a wild tactical endgame where every move counts. Nepo opens with a classic Catalan setup. Duda develops symmetrically before challenging the center immediately, capturing the pawn on c4 and asking white to show his plan. White's queen zips out to a4 with a check to recapture the pawn, and now the central battle begins. Both sides bring their knights into the game, jockeying for control of the key squares. The first trade comes on d7 as knights are exchanged. With development nearly complete, both kings castle to safety, and the rooks begin to eye the open central files. The game enters a quiet maneuvering phase. Both players improve their piece placement, doubling rooks on the key files and preparing for the middle game clash. The position remains perfectly balanced. The final preparatory pawn moves are played. The structures are solid, but you can feel the tension building towards a break in the center. And there's the break. Duda uncorks a brilliant sacrifice knight to d5. This isn't about winning material, it's a positional sack to shatter white's coordination and open lines for black's own pieces. Nepo has no choice but to accept the sacrifice. The knight takes on d5, and black immediately recaptures with the e-pawn. After the fireworks, the players maneuver towards a queen trade. The queens come off the board on e5, and we head into a complex but still very level endgame. Nepo has a slight edge here thanks to his bishop pair, but he makes an inaccuracy that lets it slip. The right way to press was with a central pawn push. The much stronger pawn to d4 challenges black immediately. After pawn to a5, white takes on c5. Black pushes to b5, and the rook swings to c2, simply winning a pawn. But in the game, Nepo pushes the pawn to b4, and this gives Duda a chance to equalize. But Duda misses his chance. He immediately captures the pawn on b4, which is exactly what white wants. The key was to ignore the pawn and play rook to e7, targeting white's weak e3 pawn. And Nepo punishes instantly. Bishop takes on b4 is a fantastic move, the only one that keeps a winning advantage. He shores up his queenside and renews the threat of pushing his d-pawn. Black pushes the pawn to a5, trying to create some counterplay, but white calmly drops the bishop back to d2, sticking to the plan. Black is under serious pressure and makes another slip. This rook move is too passive. To stay in the game, he needed to fight for the center. The best defense was pawn to d4. After king to f1, bishop to e7, white captures, and bishop to d6 keeps the position tenable. Instead, in the game, the rook goes to d6, and white's advantage grows even larger. Nepo is in full control now. The rook slides to c2, and the pawn to a3 completely secures the queenside, and another passive move from Duda. He desperately needs to create counterplay, but this knight move isn't it. The active idea was to challenge white on the queenside. The much better try was pawn to b5. After rook to b1, the pawn pushes to b4, then d4, and pawn takes a3 wins a pawn for black. But instead, the knight drops back to e7, a quiet move in a position that demands action, and Nepomniachtchi methodically tightens the screws. The rook invades on b5, the king walks towards the center, and the bishop on g2 is an absolute monster, controlling the long diagonal. With the queenside locked down, Nepo opens a second front. He pushes his kingside pawns, tearing open the position around black's king and creating new weaknesses to attack. Defending this position is a nightmare, and Duda makes another error. The king needs to help defend the kingside, but it moves away from the action. The better try was to use a pawn. Pushing the pawn to g5 was best. Then pawn to f5, d4, e4, and knight to c6 keeps black fighting. Back in the game, though, the king steps away to e8, which just makes white's attack even easier. White advances the a-pawn, fixing a weakness, and then the bishop on d2 reroutes to c1, preparing to join the decisive assault. This rook move is another misstep for black. The rook is simply misplaced on e6. The correct defensive idea was still to lock down the kingside. The better defense was pawn to g5. After pawn to f5, d4, e4, the rook comes to c6, but in the game, the rook lands on e6, and now white's planned d4 push is completely crushing. And here it comes. The bishop swings to a3, a fantastic move that puts immense pressure on black's entire setup. Black's king steps to d8, but this is a mistake in a tough position, as it walks right into a winning tactic for white based on bishop takes knight on e7. There it is. The central pawn rams forward to d4. This is the breakthrough Nepo has been building towards for the last 20 moves, and the bishop drops back to f8, but this is the decisive error. This misses the only defense and allows a forced sequence starting with bishop takes e7 that wins a full rook. A rare slip from Nepo. He pushes the pawn to g5, which is still completely winning, but he misses the immediate clinical tactic that would have won a rook on the spot. Duda gets a brief chance to complicate things after white's slip-up, but he fails to find the best defense. The only try was to activate his rook. The best move was rook to c7. After rooks are traded, the king recaptures, white takes on e7, and black's rook takes back. But he misses it, and instead the bishop returns to g7, allowing Nepo to get right back on his winning track. White immediately cashes in, taking the knight on e7 with check. The king is forced to recapture, and black's key defender is gone. Nepo snatches the pawn on d5, and this is more than enough to win. But incredibly, there was an even stronger move that would have ended the game much faster. The absolute killer was bishop to h3. After rook to e4, white takes the rook on d7, then bishop takes d4, and pawn takes d4 wins a full rook. Instead of that, Nepo simply captures the pawn on d5, which is a very practical and still completely winning choice. Black puts up some final resistance with his rook, but white's bishop on c6 is a monster, and the d-pawn marches forward, ready to decide the game. And that is the final mistake. Pushing the pawn to f6 fatally weakens the dark squares around the king and allows white's e-pawn to become an unstoppable force. Nepo immediately pushes his pawn to e4, black has to deal with the kingside threats and captures the pawn on g5. And Nepo finds the thunderbolt. Pawn to e5, a brilliant move and the only one that secures the win on the spot. Here's the crushing idea. If black captures on f4, the pawn takes the rook on d6 with check. The king recaptures and the white king steps to f3, winning a piece by force. The position is completely hopeless, and this final rook move just accelerates the end. The only way to even try to resist was to capture on f4. Had he played pawn takes f4, white has the same idea. Pawn takes d6 check, king takes d6, king to f3, and bishop to d4, but in the game, the rook moves to d8, and this allows an even quicker and more brutal finish. And there's the final blow. Pawn to d6, check. This pawn push unleashes a discovered attack from the rook on b5, and black's rook on d8 is lost. The game is over, and at this point Jacob Duda resigned the game. A fantastic, hard-fought victory for Ian Nepomniachtchi. Duda saw that the position was completely hopeless because of this forced line. The rook is forced to take the pawn on d6. The e-pawn recaptures with another check. The king must take back. And now white's rook simply snaps off the pawn on g5. The king can move to e7, but white is up a clean piece with an easily winning endgame.